Okay, so this video is going to focus on horizontal and vertical integration. This is relevant to section B of the AS exam, and more specifically, it is probably most useful for helping you discuss ownership. It can probably fit it into other areas, but it's primarily an ownership-related kind of theory. So let's get right into it. Obviously, vertical integration and horizontal integration can apply to any company out there. However, in this case, I'm going to talk about it in respect to film. So vertical integration is where a company owns several almost links of the chain that allow for the production, marketing, and distribution of a film. Disney is a great example of this, or Walt Disney Studios. So let's move on to this diagram to hopefully help explain that. So we've got Infinity Wars here, which is obviously a Walt Disney Company production. So that would have been, the production of that film would have been overseen by Marvel Studios, which is our production company. But that is actually a subsidiary, so a part of the Walt Disney Company. Then, at some point in the editing phase, they would have obviously needed to hand their footage over to a special effects studio to oversee that, because the special effects of this movie would have taken a lot of time and as much money almost as the production phase. So they hand it over to a separate company. In this case, it's Industrial Light and Magic. Now, this is a component of LucasArts. Only a few years ago, the Walt Disney Company bought LucasArts, thus making it another subsidiary. So that means that the production of the film is handed, the footage is handed over to Industrial Light and Magic, which is part of the Walt Disney Company as well, for the special effects to be added. Then the music is composed by Alan Silvestri, but this was distributed on CD by Hollywood Records, which again is a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company. The distribution to cinemas and Blu-ray and things like that is being overseen by the Disney Motion Picture Studio, which, surprise, surprise, is a subsidiary of the Walt Disney Company. That eventually has culminated at this point in $2.1 billion of box office returns. That means they've made $2.1 billion back from this movie from their original $400 million budget. Essentially, what vertical integration is all of these companies in this chain belong to Disney, going from the original inception of the concept down to the actual finished product. Many of the companies involved belong to Disney, and that is an example of vertical integration. Compare this to Annihilation. So you've got your $55 million budget, you've got your concept, and then production is overseen by DNA Films. This is an independent production studio based in Britain. The visual effects were done by D-Neg, or I can't remember what D-Neg is, D-Negative. Again, that's an independent visual effects studio, also based in Britain. These two companies, other than working together on this project, are not linked. So DNA Films would have handed their footage and their ideas over to D-Neg and worked closely with them to add special effects to the film. But ultimately, a fee will have been needed to have changed hands between these companies at some point in the production phase. Music written by Ben Salisbury, again a separate composer, fine, same as Disney, but it's published by Gold Hill Music, which is an independent music publisher, which means again the returns from the publisher of this music, some will have had to go to Gold Hill. And in distribution, in the US and China, we know it's Paramount Pictures, but also because we know Paramount were worried about the, shall we say, very intelligent and very kind of genre twisting narrative. Essentially, this was a unique and risky film. Because they were scared of it, effectively, they handed over distribution rights for the rest of the world to Netflix. So even in these four small areas of the production of this film, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different companies all involved, all separate to one another. This means, even though arguably because Paramount's questionable distribution methods, but also the fact that the movie was a bit of a risk, the box office was very small, and so actually its film made a loss. But it means that even if it had made a profit, this profit would need to be spread amongst far more companies, so smaller profits would have been made amongst each. In addition, these companies need to communicate with each other independently. So this means that actually, it's almost like the right hand trying to talk to the left. It can mean that sometimes miscommunication or issues in the vision of the final product can emerge. The perfect example of this is the disagreement between DNA Films and the movie's director, who's Alex Garland, and then eventually Paramount Pictures, who wanted a reshoot, which was eventually rejected. That is something that is usually endemic to non-vertically integrated productions. So as I said, advantages and disadvantages of vertical integration. The main one for companies like Disney is they get to keep a larger part of the pot, and it also means companies can work together on a shared vision more cohesively. In the terms of independent ones, it means small companies like DNA Films get to make movies. It means they can work with other companies as they're not vertically integrated. It means they need to contact these companies and work with them, but it can result in problems in disagreements between companies. And it also means they get to split they have to split the pot, which in this case turns out to be a smaller box office, but that's kind of irrelevant to the vertical integration thing. So that then brings us to horizontal integration. This is where a company acquires additional assets in the same field that they already own. So again, using Disney as an example, Disney at some point bought Pixar. This was because they weren't content with holding their market share of children's animation with just using Disney Animation Studios, which was, very successful. A lot of very good movies and a lot of market share was held by this. But at some point in the past, they eventually purchased Pixar. This was quite some time ago now. That meant they then held a greater share of the children's animation market. This has also happened more recently with the not being content with the family kind of adventure movies of Marvel Studios. They purchased LucasArts, which gave them Star Wars, which again kind of gives them a greater hold of the blockbuster family adventure / sci-fi market, which is actually quite big. Both the Avengers franchise and Star Wars are pretty huge. They're both multi-billion-dollar franchises. So in terms of what this allows for, it allows simultaneous production is the first goal. So while Pixar were working on Inside Out, Disney Animation Studios were working on Wreck-It Ralph at the same time. It also means they can do staggered releases. So, for example, they might in the spring release Inside Out and then in the summer release Wreck-It Ralph or vice versa. Make sure you check your facts on release dates. I'm just quoting this as an example. And that means you then get these staggered releases where movies are constantly being released. It's no surprise that, for example, in the spring of 2019, we're looking at Captain Marvel. Then we've got a bit of a gap, and then we've got Avengers Endgame, and then we've got a bit of a gap, and then there'll be the Star Wars movie that's in production, and then there'll be another Marvel movie, and then there'll be another Star Wars movie, and the same goes for children's film. Pixar and Disney Animation Studios are working almost out of synchronization, frequently releasing films. Horizontal integration also means you kind of control the market a bit better. If they hadn't bought out Pixar, it might be something that they'd have to face in the future where Pixar would release a movie at the same time as Disney Animation Studios, which would create competition for the audience. Having control of all the studios means that Disney can ensure that the movies never end up in competition with one another and thus damage their income. The other thing horizontal integration allows for is it allows you to reuse assets on multiple productions. So, for example, Avengers Endgame and Star Wars Episode 9, which is in production, both are in production at the moment. Star Wars is going to be coming out a bit later. Avengers nearly finished and about to be released pretty soon, actually, in the big picture of things. Notice that means that they will be a staggered release between the two. But there are different release stages. So both being produced by Disney Production Studios. Avengers Endgame is by Marvel. Star Wars is by LucasArts. So Disney owns both of those production studios. Both films will have special effects which are generated by LucasArts. So that means LucasArts, once they finish with the Avengers Endgame special effects, just jump straight over to Star Wars and start working on that. So it means this company is constantly working on films, whereas they may have some downtime if they were a standalone special effects studio waiting for their next project. And then again, both are going to have music published by Disney, which means Disney gets to reuse its publishing companies constantly. So it allows for simultaneous production. It allows for staggered releases of movies that appeal to the same audience. So, for example, children's movies, adventures, family movies. And it allows you to reuse assets on multiple productions. LucasArts special effects or industrial, I've forgotten what it's called, Industrial Light and Magic being reused for two different films is a good example of horizontal integration as well, or a good example of the benefit, rather. Summary. So, I don't know why that's happened. Vertical integration allows companies to become more efficient in the production of their film. That means they get to keep a larger quantity of the revenue, and it also means they probably work more efficiently together. Horizontal integration allows companies to produce a greater yield of products, and therefore hold a greater market share. If you combine both, if you have vertical integration, that means you get more profit. That then means you can purchase more assets, which means you can increase your vertical integration constantly, which means further profits and more horizontal integration. Eventually, you will what is called corner the market. Essentially, it means that Disney is gradually working its way towards taking over the film industry. As a perfect example of summer 2019, unless something goes wrong, it's anticipated that Disney are going to purchase 21st Century Fox at a cost of $71 billion. Now, this brings along television, news networks. The Simpsons, for example, belongs to 21st Century Fox. But looking strictly at film industry, there are two things that Disney, in my opinion, are clearly after, which are X-Men and Deadpool are rights owned by 20th Century Fox. X-Men are arguably, or before the Avengers franchise started, X-Men were amongst, if not the most popular Marvel comics. And they probably would have been the preference for Disney and Marvel Studios to produce first, but these were already taken by 20th Century Fox and already had their own movies. So purchasing that now means they can start to work the X-Men into the Avengers universe, or the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And also Deadpool, another Marvel intellectual property that Disney did not hold, but again, one that does exist in the Marvel franchise in the comic book world. So now they can start adding this to their superhero franchise, thus creating even further horizontal integration. Interestingly, it also means they've acquired the film rights to Alien, something that belongs to 20th Century Fox. This is one of the most successful sci-fi horror franchises in history. It raises a question for me: is Disney now feeling like they've cornered the children's market with Disney Animation Studios and Pixar? They've now cornered kind of the superhero and family market with Avengers, X-Men, Deadpool, Star Wars. Are they now looking to move into more adult orientated markets with Alien? That could be something to watch next, although that is purely my own kind of ruminations on the topic. I've got nothing to prove that, but I do wonder whether this is them looking to begin horizontal integration into another kind of genre and another market of film. So how does this affect us? If we look at Disney's production roster, you can see now we've got all these films that could be in production or are in production or are to be released over the next period of time. Essentially, it means that Disney is just taking over more and more of the market, and eventually means that potentially the independent film market could be snuffed out. It certainly means that the lion's share of the money is now going to Disney, and more and more and more will keep coming. That's because these films, so for example, the Avengers film, Infinity War, as we looked, is vertically integrated. The vast majority of companies involved in its production belong to Disney, which means they get to keep a lot of the profit, which has meant they're able to then buy, for example, the rights to X-Men, which now they've got all the studios they need to vertically integrate that production, which gives them even more funds to eventually buy other production studios, other special effects studios, music distributors, etc. Gradually, Disney is slowly but surely cornering the market.